I'm the founder of a magazine that is to state and local area what government executive is to the federal area. It's a policy and management magazine covering states, cities, counties, and so on. And I've known most of these panelists for quite some period of time because they are part of the state and local community here in Washington. Believe it or not, there is one, and it's actually fairly sizable. And it has a great deal of stability to it. So over a period of time, you really get to know the people, and it was very easy to put the panel together. Let me just start off by saying I've had this feeling about the whole idea that we've got to downsize government, make it smaller, and so on, that whole concept could use a healthy dose of reality. And now I think that is actually happening. Because even as the collapse in state revenues seem finally to have bottomed out, the full brunt of the Great Recession is washing over most states and cities like a tsunami, carrying away programs and people on a scale that, to me, was unimaginable not that long ago. So as this year's state budgets have worked their way through legislatures, reality really is beginning to set in. Education, for instance, at all levels, from preschool to graduate school, is being eviscerated. Something like 2/3 of the school districts in the country already have laid off some 250,000 teachers and education staff. School days are being cut back, hours are being cut back, and so on. You see it all in the papers. State funding of university systems already had fallen to 60% of their revenues before this latest round of cuts. Some of the nation's flagship campuses now will rely on state governments for somewhere around 20% of their revenues. I'm on the alumni board of University of North Carolina. We've gone well south of that now. We're at about 17%. UVA is now below 10%. It is, for all intents and purposes, a private university. Meanwhile, tuitions are soaring by as much as 20% a year. In Florida, there have been 3 15% increases year after year after year because the state constitution doesn't allow anything more than a 15% cut. So over 3 years, almost 50% cut. Same, very true in California. In all, there have been close to 650,000 layoffs of public sector workers between August of 2008 and September 1. Before this is over, that number may soar upwards to 800,000, about 80% of whom will be people who worked for local governments, not only teachers, but also public safety employees, social workers, and others. Nothing really is immune. I'm amazed at some of the stuff being cut, but particularly state aid to local governments, state parks, mental health programs, all kinds of things. No one thinks much about courts and judges. This is a good example. Don't think about it very much, but the vast majority of the civil and criminal cases in the country, 40 million of them annually, run through state court systems. Since they are largely invisible to the public, it's easy to starve them. New York's judges have not had a salary increase in 12 years. The top judges in Massachusetts, reacting to the latest cuts to the judicial budget, are urging the governor not to nominate any more judges because they can't pay them. Instead, they have to close 11 courthouses and lay off staff. It's a perverse paradox that just as state revenues are bottoming out, years of budget cuts are biting hardest. One of the reasons in the fading stimulus is the fading stimulus monies, particularly for Medicaid. That alone is $103 billion that has disappeared as of June 30. The same with $48 billion for education. Even before the stimulus, federal funds accounted for almost 30% of state revenues, the largest portion of the pie. So now comes the anti-stimulus, as I call it, looming cuts in federal grant programs to states and localities in critical areas like infrastructure of all kinds, but particularly transportation, economic development, medical training and research, and Medicaid, the largest federal grant to the states, which was supposed to expand significantly in coming years under the new national health care law. But now Jay Rockefeller, the chairman of the Senate committee that handles it, the health care subcommittee, says that it is definitely on the chopping block, and he adds, seniors vote, but if you're poor and disabled, you might not vote, and if you are a child, you certainly don't vote. That's a lot of Medicaid's population. They don't have any money to do any lobbying. So ironically, we may shrink Medicaid before we expand it. If there's any good news, it is that state revenues have finally begun to turn up for the past 6 quarters, but they still are at a level below where they were when this recession started, and it may be some time before we see an end to the continuing budget shortfalls that we see in some of our states. California said yesterday they're looking at another $2 billion that they're down. So imagine that, if you would, knowing your own federal agencies. Imagine operating now on a budget that is below what you had in 2006 or 2007, and you get some idea of what's going on. The bad news is that local governments are still falling. And as the new lower assessments kick in on property values around the country, it's hard to know how cities and counties, particularly in some areas like states like Arizona, Florida, Nevada, how they can rebound. The situation is exacerbated by falling aid from the states. In at least 30 states, school funding now stands below 2008 levels, often way below. These problems are also exacerbated by the pension and benefit overhang, which I'm sure you've heard about. Earlier this year, the muni bond market was really roiled when, by predictions that there would be wholesale bankruptcies of states, cities, and counties. We have not seen that today. We have 2 bankruptcies working, but they don't have anything to do with pensions, and they're not that unusual. But that isn't to say that it's possible, and it wouldn't be possible in the future, and we'll talk about that. So to explore what has happened below the federal level and what it might portend for Washington in coming months and years, let me turn to a very good panel. I used to always introduce Ray Sheppach to my left here as a recovering academic, but now he's fallen off the wagon. He really is an academic at the University of Virginia, the School of Leadership and Public Policy, and at the Miller Center at UVA for Public Affairs. But for the preceding 28 years, he was executive director of the National Governors Association, serving during that time some 300 governors. And prior to working at NJ, he was one of you. He was the deputy director of the Congressional Budget Office. Beth Keller is the president and chief executive officer of the Center for State and Local Government Excellence. The center promotes excellence in public service so that local and state governments can attract and retain the talent they need. She also serves, though, as the deputy executive director of the International City and County Managers Association. Chris Haney is the director of the Center for Research and Innovation at the National League of Cities. He oversees NLC's efforts to identify, research, and share innovative local practices and trends on subjects including public finance, economic development, housing, sustainability, infrastructure, and so on. And Andre Dua is a senior partner at McKinsey Co in New York, serving as the co-leader of its state and local government practice and co-leader of its regulatory and government strategy practice, and a member of the tech media practice. He works intensively on public sector transformation at the state and city levels, evaluating government performance, organizational design, and identifying best practices based off broad-scale benchmarking. So we have a state person, we have a state and local person, of a local person and then someone from the private sector who watches it all. And so I thought it was a good balance. So let me just kick it off, and I'm not going to call on anybody in particular. Let's just start a conversation. Now that we've seen a collapse in revenue, unlike anything we've seen in the past 70 years, we've seen strategic cuts, then not very strategic cuts, and finally now cuts in very basic government functions like healthcare, K through 12 education, higher ed, that were once off limits. And we've seen an election cycle that has produced some new governors who have been very eager to take on the public employee unions, employees and their unions. And now we've seen some of those efforts begin to unravel. So what's going on here, and what can federal officials draw from this whole experience as they begin some belt tightening of their own? Anybody?
Let me just frame it first in terms of the revenue picture. We had revenue growth at the state level for 30 years, 1978 to 2008, of about 6.5% per year. After the Great Recession, we will go through 5 years of virtual zero revenue growth. That's because it's going to take us another year and a half, 2 years to get back to the 2008 level. Then the big question is, what's the longer run? And I would probably argue that the revenue growth then is going to be closer to 4% or 4.5% as opposed to the 6.5%. And so I think what's happening now, people are beginning to realize, is that we're in a long-run problem, that we really don't talk about coming out of this. So the attitude has changed from what I would call survival of just doing budget cuts to how do we actually redesign the delivery system on major government programs. I'll just kick it off there.
And I would add more to the revenue picture, which is at the local government level, we're now in the fifth, probably about the fourth or fifth year in a row of actual year-to-year declines, even if you adjust for cost and inflation in the sector. And we've at least got a couple of years to go. We don't know whether that's 2 years or 4 years, in part because we don't know what's happening with the national economy. But to second what Ray has said, there are a number of other indicators around pensions, healthcare benefits, long-term infrastructure costs, which suggest if you're a local government official, you're not thinking, I need to get through 2 years of fiscal constraints. You're thinking about 10, 15 years. And so you're advising the local elected officials that you're serving that they've got long-term issues, that they have a chance or an opportunity to reset here as they look at the out picture, which is a difficult thing in part because they're dealing with folks who have very short-term electoral cycles.
Let me just pick up on the people aspects, because at all levels of government we rely on the people who are public service oriented to get the work done for us in the smartest way possible. And I think the lessons for me that are interesting are that even in those places that have experienced hiring freezes, pay freezes, layoffs, the smartest ones are investing in professional development. So they're recognizing that if they have a smaller workforce, that it's got to be absolutely critical that they have the kinds of skills and training that they need to cover more space and to think about it more strategically. And the same is true with the compensation packages. Lots of conversations taking place about pensions, health care, salaries, but I think not enough with the employees to figure out what's important to them and how to craft something that's both affordable and meets human resources goals.
Andre, you have anything to add?
Well, a big conundrum I see here is, on the one hand, you've got this real pressure to reduce the budgets. But on the other hand, I think we're seeing more and more at the frontline level that citizens actually aren't happy to cut any services. So you've got both the demand for do it with less, but don't do anything less. If anything, do it better. So you've got this fundamental real challenge here, and there are sort of two strategies that have been employed, one of which I think is a short-term strategy, which is just cutting. You know, there's a whole lot of hacking going on in budgets in billion-dollar terms, cutting programs and so forth, but the real issue is what I'd say is what's the transformation agenda? which is, I think, Ray, very similar to what you're saying, which is how does service delivery have to change? And the thing we're experiencing, which I think is very relevant on the federal side, which is how do you achieve and implement the large-scale change that's going to be needed? And we've been exploring lots of different mechanisms. States, as you know, have been using commissions a lot. There are lots of efforts to come up, generate ideas, but our experience is turning out to be that a lot of that is sort of beside the point, and the real issue is you've got systems of tens of thousands of employees who are used to doing things a particular way, and in order to get the service delivery change you want, you actually have to change the behavior of tens of thousands of people, and that's a very significant challenge. And it's the same challenge that my colleagues and I deal with in the private sector, which is you've essentially got companies which need to turn around. In this case, you could almost say the public sector needs a turnaround, but producing a report, having a commission, or generating a list of ideas ain't going to get you there. And the real thing we're trying to get underneath is what are the conditions that need to be in place to actually enroll people, make them part of the change, get them bought into the change, help them build new skills and capabilities, and drive over a multi-year period to a different way of doing things.
We've taken a look at a lot of these governor's commissions on, streamlining government. And when you go back and look 2-3 years later, it's not a very impressive record of achievement. Right. And we've also noticed on particularly these sort of large-scale management redos of agencies and how they operate, especially when you have a heavy IT component to it. The technology may work, but the people ain't ready. And they have not been sufficiently prepared, usually, for how they're going to have to change their work habits. Is that too...
No, I think that's fair. I'd go further, which is little to no thought is given to how to implement and transform the system in the way you want. A lot of thought is given to what are the ideas, often at a too general level, but not enough thought is given to how would this work in practice, how are we going to get people to change what they're doing, and it's almost rethinking the strategy process. It's how do you design a strategy process that from its outset bakes into it mechanisms that will increase the likelihood of success of the change. And it happens that in addition to state work, I'm actually also doing some federal work in one of the large cabinet agencies where we're experiencing just that. It's the slow blocking and tackling of how do you start within PMB and start to change how they do things, how they do enterprise services, how they do consolidation of IT. But it's a slow sequence phase of work where you're making sure you're getting change going all the time.
I think one of the beauties of local government, just to talk about that for a minute, is you have many more experiments taking place out there. And picking up on technology as one, I think that does offer opportunities both for the way people work and the way we deliver services. And in the area of public safety, which is a huge expenditure for local governments, we're starting to see things that people never used to talk about before, such as 2 cities sharing a 911 system, because now they have technology that makes it possible for Palo Alto to back up Mountain View. They're doing it almost as an emergency management strategy, but they also see it as a way to save money down the road. So that's a really nice application. And the smarter places are also using telework. It's something that appeals to a lot of people in government. Helps them manage complex lives and long commutes. So now that we have technology, we can make life a little better for people if we're not paying them quite as well as we used to.
I'm glad you brought it. Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, of course, we're in a dynamic situation too. So at the same time, we're trying to cut and redo systems. States are responsible for the exchanges that are going to be set up under the health care. And also by expanding Medicaid probably for an additional 16 million people. That means you virtually have to redo all of your systems because most states, the Medicaid system has to talk to the new exchange because people don't know which one they're eligible for. And Medicaid also has to be integrated with food stamps and welfare and all your other programs. So at the same time you're talking about redoing systems, to save money, you're also having to build out completely new systems.
There's a people piece of this that, I mean, it's sort of in the sense that, come back to Beth's point and Ray's point about the service delivery piece is, you know, a lot of this, there's an opportunity in all of this, which is, these are pretty old agencies, bureaucracies, or forms of government, right? They haven't really changed dramatically in 4 or 5 decades. They deliver things much the way they delivered them 80 and 90 years ago in some respects, with some technology upgrades. And the problem that they're facing is they don't change quickly. These are big ships to turn. But it's actually creating a people problem for them in that they're not effectively competing for talent. And Beth's organization's done a lot of work sort of categorizing and putting some numbers to this. But, you know, I've got a staff at my organization of 15 people, about half of whom are under 30. And not one of them, when we sit around and talk about what their career would look like, wants to work for the federal government or a state government or a local government. And it's because they have perceptions that they won't be able to innovate, that they won't be able to do something cool, that they won't be able to change the world, or whatever it is that the stereotype that fits. We got a real problem with, given that we got a whole bunch of people from a demographic standpoint, they're going to retire out of very professional positions, and we got a highly talented generation looking to do some pretty innovative stuff. They're going to go into not-for-profit and private sector because they're looking to do something innovative, and they don't think they can do that in the public sector. That's got to change in the next 5 to 10 years in order to really inject some talent and creativity into this field.
To that point, I've had a fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard complain that they were losing so many of their graduates to McKinsey and Company. Thanks a lot.
Well, and to bring it back to Ray's point about the complexity of the Medicaid expansion and the kind of small group of people that really understand the system and how it works and how old they are, and the fact that they're eligible to retire. I interviewed some of these folks, and one of their concerns was just what you brought up, Chris, that in the state of Washington, to be specific, the person I interviewed said, I used to feel like I could attract people because public service had a great image, our benefit packages were really good. And we didn't compete on salary, but we had these other attributes. He said, and now I'm really worried because the way that we talk about public service, I'm concerned it's going to make it hard to fill some of these positions. And then we have other language issues where we talk about people willing to come back after they've retired and work some more for state government or local government. We're calling them double dippers, as though it's bad that they would be willing to come back and help solve critical problems. So I think we have a language problem in the way that we're talking about some of these issues.
Well, I worry that we've denigrated public service in our political debate in the last 2-3 years in particular. I mean, I wrote a column about it, so it's really on my mind, but I have some teacher friends up in Ohio where, you know, it's been a very, very contentious issue, and they took away their bargaining rights and so on, and then this last election, it was all reversed. But I remember this woman with tears in her eyes. She's 2 years away from retirement. She spent her whole life teaching in Toledo School, which are not easy schools to teach in, saying, you know, now all of a sudden we are portrayed as the enemy. And people down in the ranks do have that feeling. I mean, they feel pretty put upon. I think to some extent maybe more than they should, because when these election results start coming in, all of a sudden the majority of the people are with them. So, you know, that's what I meant about the 2010 election certainly changed the equation, and yet we're beginning to see some unraveling of what some of these governors have done.
Let me just throw a little optimism out
Yeah.
there. Just
Wow.
so, you know, I'm not always gloom and doom, but there are areas in state government, I think, that we do basically everything wrong, which is the criminal justice area, for example. We went through 3 strikes and you're out, and we locked up everybody. And now we find that we have a lot of long-term care facilities that are prisoners where we're spending huge amounts of money. But it's an area that's 6 or 7%, I think, of state budgets, where one could objectively actually I think, change a lot of things in a very, very positive way and save money at the same time. So I think there are areas, and I think that particularly with new governors and so, sometimes new employees can be given a fair amount of room to innovate and make changes, particularly in areas where you've got the possibility of both increasing quality outputs and decreasing costs. And I think there are a fair number of opportunities within state government to do that. And those are things you couldn't get done at other times, but you could get done now. So just a little bit of optimism out there.
Well, let me throw a little optimism out there too, and see if this isn't just pie in the sky. And it goes to some of the things you've been talking about. If I saw a word creeping into the vocabulary out in the country, and maybe here too, well, I know here too, actually, it would be collaboration. For some reason, the United States, I think, as a society, has sort of a culture of fragmentation. It's sort of the, individualism and so on that plays out institutionally, so that we really love silos. And that's not just in government. It's in business. It's really in higher education and so on. I see it beginning to fall away. And I see it out in the country with this effort at regionalism, where people are turning around and saying, wait a minute, the states may be, the preeminent in our political structure, but they're really not. It's metro areas that are, it's regions. And all around the world, economies are forming around regions, around city-states. And some states are really beginning to get that. And the feds are beginning to get it. There's effort on sustainability, sustainability communities that were HUD, Department of Transportation, and EPA are working together now to present their grants and their requirements for grants to regions in an integrated way, so that regional government people don't have to go to HUD and then DOT and then EPA. It all is done at the same time, and the effort is integrated. I was just at a conference about regionalism where there was a fellow from HUD, and he was really impressive, and he was also extremely excited about what they were doing. I was just telling Ray, I read in the paper that the House just zeroed out that particular effort at HUD, DOT, and EPA. Why they would do that, I have no idea. It costs a little money to do it at the federal level, but it saves a lot of money down on the regional, local level.
It's a great example, Peter, because I think even if it got zeroed out in Congress, it's still the right strategy for places like HUD, EPA, DOT to work together. That's the kind of thing that we see on trying to solve big goals and trying to break out of our usual work structures to get across agencies. It also appeals to our younger workers to give them something like a sustainability agenda and to work across agencies has a great deal of appeal, I think, at all levels of government, because they feel like they're working on something that has real impact.
Well, and I think one of the things to say about the regionalism trend is, first, it's not new. It's not happened at the scale that people who were proponents of it thought it would be, which is they thought it would mean sort of full-scale merger of jurisdictions, and it actually rarely means that. It's been increasing at pretty dramatic pace for at least 3 decades now, kind of service level by service level. So, we did water and utility districts first, and you're seeing places do fire and police districts or interlocal agreements. You're going to see that happen around contracts on recycling and solid waste management. Local jurisdictions are starting to do it around tax collection and assessment of property across multi-jurisdictions. I mean, the pace is going to quicken coming out of this recession, but it's not going to be that jurisdiction X is going to join with jurisdiction Y and they're going to form one name. They're going to do it service delivery mechanism by service delivery mechanism, which is actually the right approach, right? If you actually go look from a research perspective at the places that have consolidated full scale, the efficiency gains for the political losses in the sense of representation and sense of identity community-wise weren't there for the most part. I mean, it just didn't work out. But there have been lots of gains on this kind of 2 jurisdictions at a time, 4 jurisdictions at a time, figuring out what's the economy of scale to deliver a particular service more effectively. And I think there's a lot of that happening now that's not very easy to pick up in the newspaper, but is spreading as a best practice or an innovation around the country.
Just to pick up on that point, I think when we look for different ways to deliver services, keeping competition in mind is the right way to go. So if you do outsourcing, if you think about that, you may want to be sure you're including other public agencies as a place for outsourcing. So it might not be outsourcing your police functions to a private provider. It might be to another local government. And then if that doesn't work out well, you take it back, you competitively bid it again, and you look for another provider. And that's one of the ways that we have learned in the local government level, how to do this in a way that keeps the public sector in the driver's seat and allows you to fix something if it goes awry.
The other bit of collaboration I think I see taking place is private sector, public sector. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean, a lot of people say, well, they're going to start public-private partnerships. I mean, that's not exactly it. It's chambers of commerce starting to merge with each other to become regional chambers. It is not the Denver Chamber of Commerce anymore. It's Denver Metro. It's Atlanta Metro, and so on. And they are bringing along public sector people with them. They want a plan for the region, for the area. Here are our strengths. Here are our weaknesses. Here's what we need to be adding. Here's what we have enough of. Here, these are our real assets. And they are doing it more and more. And public leaders are falling right in step with them. Do you see that?
It's one of the things we've been talking about the most in the last, when we go to trying to find something optimistic to say. There's a lot of undercapitalized resources in terms of where the private sector would like to be involved as a partner, particularly around infrastructure services or around economic development strategies. First thing I would say about that is that behind it sits the same old competitive local governments fighting with each other for stuff, and that's okay. We shouldn't think that they're not going to be rational about that, but they're realizing that they have there's an incentive to market, for example, the Seattle region. Nobody outside of the United States knows what the Puget Sound means, right? They know that you're in Seattle, even if you're Bellevue or Redmond or Everett or whatever the community might be. And so they're realizing that the global trade and regional economic development strategy has to be combined. Now, if we can get the firm, or we can get that economic development, we'll compete about where it's located afterwards inside of the region. And we'll be just as competitive as we always were about that. But we at least have a combined strategy to do that. And on the infrastructure piece, what's really great is that there's some terrific practices that are emerging that are being learned, particularly on the infrastructure arena, about how to better strike these deals. So there was lots of attention early on to the tollways in Indiana and Chicago and selling off of parking facilities in Chicago. And a lot of people thought those weren't very good deals. But there's the Washington Post here has been doing some great articles about 100 projects around the country that are actually really striking some pretty effective deals where the private sector is bringing a lot of capital to bear, a facility is getting built, the price of using it will not be tremendously higher than what was already there, and it's solving a problem. And so we're learning from that, actually, but it's happening very quickly.
Last thing I saw, I said that the deal in Indiana was too good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Might also put on, I think there's opportunities for state-federal collaboration. We know that about a third of the domestic discretionary spending really comes to state and local government, and that's being cut quite dramatically. And I've always felt governors would, in fact, there's about 170 categorical grants that come to state and local government, $150 billion. And there's a lot of inefficiency in those areas, and moving towards 8 or 10 broad block grants where you actually, the states and the federal government sit down and negotiate out what would be appropriate performance standards, and then you build some system where if the state didn't perform, they get a penalty. If they perform better than it, they could get a small bonus. But I think in that particular area, governors are probably very willing to accept less money for more flexibility. And rather than doing just the financial audits, I think that we do need to push more into the performance area. And so that's an area that I think, given the amount of change that's probably going to take place over the next several years in those grants, there is an opportunity, I think, for some serious state, federal collaboration to really change those programs and perhaps increase substantially the outcomes.
Just to amen that, but add local government to the mix, because everything everything that we do in government almost always winds up in a local community somewhere, and so making sure that the people, it's just like in our agencies, if we don't ask the people on the front lines how well things are working, how's it going, what can we do better, we're missing the boat. So I really think we've got to be much more strategic, not just across agencies, but across all levels of government, and find ways to have these candid conversations about how do we stretch our dollars, how do we meet the goals, and what kind of metrics make any sense? Because we bean count a lot, but we don't always ask the right questions to get good data on what's making a difference when it comes to things like energy. You know, what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and are we collecting any data to measure that?
Andre, I'm going to ask you, is it possible to have significant cuts in resources and still improve performance?
Well, I was actually just thinking about that, because right behind your head, I keep staring at this big sign which says Lessons from the States. Yeah. And I was trying to think about exactly what are the few areas in which something like that has worked, where you cut budgets and you deliver better performance. And I would highlight a few areas, I think many of which are relevant at the federal level. The first is, I would say, that selectively moving to enterprise services models can work. I think there are good examples in the states, whether that be on real estate management or vehicle and aviation fleet management or other forms of shared service or enterprise service. That can work. So I think they're examples of spend less money, deliver the same or better services in some cases. They haven't worked everywhere, but I think if you sort of say, what's one way that federal departments can tackle some of the budget issue, I think systematically thinking through what should stay in bureaus and agencies, what should be more centralized at the department level, and I think that's a very sophisticated question, but you can get to a good answer. I think the second thing I would say is that some of the states have shown that you can deliver better customer service. California, the Department of Transportation has shown you can reduce time in line. There are other states who've shown that real customer-facing functions, can be improved. And there are myriad places across the federal government where I think there are interactions with citizens. Take the National Park Service. Or there are other places where you can say, what service are we delivering? How can that, if we took the view of the customer, how could that be better? How could the permit be delivered faster? And so forth. So I think that's a second lesson I would draw from the states. The third I would say is that organizational consolidation and simplification can work. There are a number of states who are saying, gee, this patchwork of agencies, boards, commissions, Washington just went through this. Texas did this in its performance review back a decade ago. New York is doing it now. Connecticut is looking at it. Massachusetts has done something. And I think there are many examples at the city level as well. So I think that's a third lesson for federal agencies, which is there opportunity for organizational simplification which can reduce levels, reduce and eliminate silos, but still allow you to deliver services more effectively. And the fourth I would highlight is that there are well thought through performance management systems that work to improve performance, whether that be what's been tried in Maryland with StateStat, or what's been tried in Washington with GMAP, which is the Government Management Accountability and Performance System. And so I think there are mechanisms, many of which would apply at the federal level, which could be very valuable in switching to a more results-oriented approach. And the final one, I think there are not many examples of this, but the experiments in handing over a little bit more flexibility and taking back a little in budget, like the charter agencies in Iowa, are another example of a more creative model where you say, okay, we'll be willing to give you more flexibility, but we have a budget issue, so let's set up these charter agencies. And we can go into how well they worked or not, but I would say on balance there was something good that came out of those charter agencies.
Well, my question there would be, did they survive the change in governor?
Actually, I haven't looked at those lately. I mean, I think that's always the issue with some of these experiments. And, how do you get them to be durable across?
It brings out the journalist in me, but when I hear about some things like the performance reviews, for instance, Texas performance review, yes, I think it was probably pretty successful. So they tried to do the same thing in California. Schwarzenegger brought in the guy from Texas who'd done it, and it was a catastrophe.
Disaster.
Why? I think, anyway, because Schwarzenegger mishandled it. He oversold it. He didn't really understand it. He went out there and, as a salesman and pushed it, and none of it ever went anywhere.
I think that's
but it's
and
true.
there are many examples of ones that have not gone anywhere. So I think it's really finding those few, and there are only a handful in some cases.
And while I got you, these public-private partnerships, federal people are very used to dealing with corporations because so much of federal work is done by contractors. I think it's less true in states and localities. I mean, it's still done, of course, but not to the extent that it is in the federal government. We mentioned the Indiana Toll Road, and for those of you who don't know, the state of Indiana basically leased its main highway through the state for, 75 years or something like that to a Australian bank and a Spanish infrastructure company.
Yeah.
And the governor, who's the current governor, Governor Daniels, really took a hit for it. But if anything, it has been more successful from a business point of view than they thought it would be. Macquarie has sort of taken a bath on it. Indiana's doing quite well.
It's because they don't have the traffic they expected because of the economic downturn, right?
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think so.
Well, and I think, Daniels has been kind of flippant about it in the press, but I don't think the most successful public-private partnerships involve the public sector announcing that the private sector's taken a bath and look how great we did.
Absolutely not.
I think the most successful relationships are going to result when the private sector guys say, yeah, we met our revenue expectations. This has been a huge success. Where are the next 10 projects? And the local government guys are saying, look, they effectively put a piece of infrastructure in place and are maintaining and operating it at a higher level than we can operate it. They're pricing it effectively, which the public wouldn't let us do, which is a significant problem. And, win-win, right? I'm not sure that the way that that's playing out politically is very good for the industry in the long term.
I think it's a disaster.
Yeah.
As a recent American citizen, so I've been in America, I'm Australian, and I'm very familiar with Macquarie Bank. In Australia, it's known as the Millionaire's Factory. But it's very interesting to see, actually, how the privatization or the private-public partnership issue has become so polarizing in this country when, relative to other developed OECD countries, America is pretty much last in looking at more creative mechanisms to provide services and infrastructure which citizens need, but which aren't easily funded, particularly in the current fiscal environment, by governments. And it led us to, 5 or 6 years ago, say this is not worth thinking about in the US because the political environment for it doesn't exist. Whereas I think, this is one of these areas where I think there are good practices out there. It's a question of being very selective about what's worked, why it's worked, would it work here? If not, how would you need to change it? I mean, airports, roads, the list of things that have some public-private partnership or partial or full privatization is very long elsewhere in the world, and in countries that most Americans would say are socialist countries. Right? So it's very interesting.
I want you all to be thinking of questions you'd like to ask these folks. You want to start?
Yes.
What agency are you?
I'm not with any.
Thank you. I hope this is better. Chris brought up a very interesting point, and that is how to bring cool back to public sector. Those weren't your exact words, but
Right.
and on that point, I think you raise a very critical point here, because we do need the brightest and the most innovative minds in the public sector. And Elizabeth talked a little bit about how some of these interdepartmental collaboration opportunities create challenges and issues that that would appeal to some of the brighter minds, because it makes them feel like they're working on something that's meaningful. And so on that point, and this is a question for everyone here, how do we attract some of the best minds? It's certainly not the most lucrative field. I think most everyone would agree with that. But how do you go about putting together, not only at the state and a city level, but at a federal level, how do you bring cool back to public sector?
I'll start off. First of all, I don't entirely disagree that it's gone. I think down in agencies and so on, that may well be true. But what really gets me about seeing some of these governors, and particularly mayors, is that they are surrounded by, and the better the mayor is, usually the more this is true, they are surrounded by very bright, young men and women who are having the time of their lives. And I know one of them whose father is right here in the room, who has worked for a mayor and a governor in Maryland, who fits this pattern. But I see it all the time. I'll give you a little vignette. Flying back from India after a long hiking trip, overnight flight right over the pole, was with a young woman, an Indian woman, Indian American now, whose husband lived in New York and was just started out in a law firm. She was just finishing up at Northwestern in Chicago, but her great ambition was to go to New York and work for Michael Bloomberg. She thought Michael Bloomberg was exactly the kind of boss she wanted to have, and the idea of, and she was in the Northwestern Business School. I've forgotten what it's called, and I obviously top of her class and all that. Richard Daley, of all people, Richard Daley surrounded himself with these incredible kids who were given an enormous amount of responsibility. And I know, because we dealt with them, the magazine dealt with them in setting up things in Chicago and so on. They were very effective. The difference between them and the very top people at the private firms we dealt with, I couldn't tell you what they were. They were cream of the crop. So it can happen.
One thing I would say we have a challenge with in government right now, because we've had hiring freezes and we're nervous about budgets, we're tending not to bring in entry-level professionals. So our pipeline is not as good as it should be. We also don't do a great job on our recruitment processes. And sometimes if you look at your job descriptions, they put you to sleep. And we have, of course, a need to re-engineer some of the jobs too, because we may need to really change what we're doing in a dramatic way to appeal to the right people. So I would just, I think, in local government anyway, I know they don't have the young people in their workforce. That we've got all kinds of demographic data to show it, and I suspect the same is true in the federal government, but I haven't looked at it.
I think a lot of it is just recognizing, and here again I'd say Beth's organization's done more than ours has, but that folks want a different thing. They want a different package coming out. You don't sell anybody who's coming out of a good graduate program in this country on the idea that you'll be paid a little less so in 30 years from now you can retire because you had a great set of pension and health care benefits. Doesn't sell, right? They want to spend 3 years in the public sector, 3 years working at McKinsey, 2 years working for a small not-for-profit, come back into something or other. They might want to start something on their own. And I'm not saying that that's limited to under 30-year-olds. There could be people at this, everybody in the room may want to do some of that, but you're not going to attract somebody with the way that the state and local government system or even the federal system is currently structured. And let me give you just one quick example. I have a good friend who was recently looking for work. She found 2 jobs that she was really interested in. One was with the Economic Development Administration, commerce, where she would have to apply through the USA Jobs process. Another one was at Google, at their offices that they've been growing here in Washington, D.C. She could file her resume or CV in under 15 minutes at Google. She spent 3 days applying for USA Jobs. But she just quit, right? She just quit even applying for the Economic Development Administration job. We as the American people need a lot more people who are interested in the Economic Development Administration and maybe a little less interested in Google, and that means that whole system's got to change.
Anybody else?
I was intrigued by your regionalization discussion. I was born in Seattle, so what if we eliminated or removed? What would be the impact of removing King County or removing counties throughout the United States, and you only had the states and the cities and their spheres of influence? I mean, I know politically, yeah, tough road, obviously, but nobody talked about county management, and frankly, I don't know what it brings to the table. Would there be a better distribution of flow of funds? Would there be more efficiencies?
I'll start because I think Ray will have some things to say on this, but the thing about it is what we call a county government is sometimes a city government. And 2 examples in this area are Montgomery County, Maryland, well, 3, Fairfax County, Arlington County. There is no other local government. That's it. They are, large jurisdictions that have all the kind of power and authority. From the state perspective, they create these monsters. And I mean that with all due respect. They're the ones that set the rules for what kinds of local entities we can have. I remember some time ago, Montana, I believe, has a referendum every 10 years to let people vote on whether they wish to continue with the type of local government that they have or not. I don't know if they're still doing that, but I thought that was fascinating, just as an example of the diversity. And I'm going to punt to you, Ray, a little bit on, I don't know that just eliminating county governments per se solves it, because that's the mechanism the states use right now to deliver services. They would, they could call them city governments, but they still need some kind of mechanism to deliver services.
Yeah, I often look at current situation, and I think what we need is vertical and horizontal integration. In other words, what states need to do is actually redesign a lot of their programs, but then what local government needs to do is to consolidate. And I always felt that actually the state should provide some funding for the consolidation, because I think you'd pick up a lot of efficiency in that regard. But I don't want to overplay. I mean, regionalism comes basically because private sector tends to form clusters, economic clusters, which drive economic growth. And Seattle has its clusters, and Northern Virginia has its clusters, and so on. And government doesn't have a huge impact on that. So we ought not to think that we somehow can create these economic clusters or can damage them or such. There's a little bit we can do by getting out of the way, and a little bit we can do by adding to it. But I think we have to understand that those firms tend to align themselves in the same area because of certain efficiencies. And that's really the driver.
Efficiencies and amenities. They're looking for quality of life also. So it's not an accident that a lot of the high growth areas are places where there's a good educational system, where people like to live. So I think it's efficiency as well as quality metrics that are part of what drives economic development.
It's a very interesting question. I think it really depends to some extent on where you are. I think Beth's point about Fairfax County, big counties like that are very good. Those are the real governments. They tend to be rather good governments. I'll give the other point of view, though. We have a cottage up in northern Michigan in Benzie County, one of the less wealthy counties in a state that's having a lot of trouble. And Benzie County has, I don't know, 2 townships and a city, Frankfurt, and I don't know how many towns, 9 towns, something like that. Not many people live in Benzie County, but the amount of government that you see, there's the Lake County Township Hall and the Crystal Township Hall, and exactly what they do compared to what the towns do. All the towns have libraries. They all have town halls. Most of them have their own police and fire. And then when you don't even want to talk about schools. And Benzie County cannot afford all this stuff, I don't think. And there should be efforts made to consolidate. The real government there is Benzie County. They're the ones who really provide most services. So it depends on where you are. It's interesting that county lines are often were formed hundreds of years ago based off how long it would take to ride by horse from anywhere in the county to the county seat. That's why they were there, and that's what an anachronism in many ways they still are. And yet, they have morphed into real powerful governments in many places. King County would actually be one of them.
I want to go to something Ray said, which is the only place that the regionalism, the idea you have works is if it comes with some fiscal trade-off. So you can get people to give up local political authority or local jurisdictional identity if there's some sort of capacity that they're getting in exchange for it, and that's the kicker. Let me use an example, which is if you were to go look at the Detroit region, right? The city of Detroit itself is one of the most struggling places, if not the most struggling place in this country, on any number of indicators. Huge budget deficits, all sorts of problems from a service and revenue perspective. But if you go to any number of the townships and little cities that sit around Detroit, and you go talk to their city managers or the town managers, they're running 300% and 400% fund balances a year. They're carrying forward 4 times the size of the town budget. They got a regional tax and revenue disparity problem in Detroit that if there was some sort of governance that was giving up authority and bringing the capacity together, might be able to do something more strongly for the region. So there is something to what you said, but there has to be a trade-off, and you can't just tell everybody to consolidate and then keep the same system of fiscal capacity.
And that's the problem you run into in so many of these sort of northeastern and midwestern older cities like Cleveland and Detroit, is that the folks out in Macomb County are not real interested in picking up the problems of downtown Detroit. So it's very hard to get anything like that through.
But I think the question's a good one. I mean, I'll end this with a rhetorical question. But does New York State need more than 600 school districts?
Yeah. Well, you do see some of it happening now under the under the pressure of the economic downturn. That is, you do see that sort of thing happening.
Yeah, a lot of smaller towns are contracting with the county for public safety services, for instance. I think that the fear is a race to the bottom. If what consolidation means is a lower standard of living, it will be resisted. But if there's a real positive trade-off, I think people are very open to it.
Peter, I have a question here.
Tim.
For the panel. Your example that you cited was an example seemingly of waste. Every town has its library, and that example there. So I have a question about public opinion. On one level, does the public see the waste in cases like that, and are they willing to do anything about it? But then secondly, as you said in your opening statement, we're having a reality check here on what less government looks like. And you went through the numbers, hundreds of thousands of layoffs, larger class sizes in the elementary and high schools, and higher tuitions in the university, and so on. And so I'm wondering whether you probably to some extent have your finger on the heartbeat of how people out there in the jurisdictions that you deal with are feeling about this. Is the public ready for less government? Is there a reaction against the trend toward fewer services that we are seeing, or is there no reaction? I think that people would be interested in whether we think that we're ready to live as a nation with less government.
That was going to be my final question. Very good. Yeah.
Well, I think where people are asking those questions, the answer is no, we don't want less services. How can we keep the public swimming pools open? San Jose asked that question because they didn't think they could afford it. Their revenue base is shot. Their population's growing, but they've cut their staffs and cutting services. The private sector stepped in to keep the swimming pools open this last year. So I do think the public generally, when you ask them, they like the services. Libraries, probably are shifting as fast as any entity in a lot of places. Buena Vista decided to collaborate with the community college because they had a high unemployment rate, and they thought they could do some, computer training, become an employment center, help people. Where do you go if you're unemployed, and you don't have a computer? How do you find jobs to apply for? So a lot of these services that elected officials or others might think are maybe not core services, they do become core services when people need jobs.
Yeah, I would say change is hard and everybody wants the status quo. I mean, we tracked a little bit school consolidation, where a lot of these rural school districts, there were not teachers of certain quality to teach chemistry or physics or 4 years of math. Through consolidation, your students could then get those courses, which you think would be an overriding kind of big gain versus the consolidation. But no, parents fought that kind of consolidation in spite of the fact that their children would get a much better education. So I think there's still a lot of hanging on to the status quo.
In Benzie County, to give you an example, we literally, in one town, Benzonia, the next one, Beulah, the drive between the two takes maybe 90 seconds. And Benzonia has its own library. Beulah has its own library. And yet, when there was a countywide vote on a surtax to help out the libraries, this is the poorest county in Michigan, and this is only a few months ago. It went 70% to support the library. I mean, they were willing to ante up the money. Same with the Benzie County bus. There's a little bus service that drives the elderly around, and anybody else drives them around to the shopping center and so on. They voted 70% to put more money into the Benzie County bus. In the middle of this recession, in the poorest county in Michigan, people will pay if they are asked and they know exactly what it's for.
And I think that goes to the question that you're asking. So if you're asking people a public opinion poll question about whether they want more or less government, you're not going to be surprised if the answer is less government. If you're asking them, do they think public employees are paid too much, you're going to get some sort of knee-jerk reaction because this just the nature of the hurt and the pain that's out there. But if you're asking people, do you like your public library, would you be willing to pony up 20 cents more a month on book fines or a sales tax increment of 10 cents on the dollar? There's a lot of yes happening out there. And I think for federal agencies, that actually says there's a lot to be done about proactive outreach about what those federal programs are that are trying to be protected. That's the message we've been sharing with the folks that we're dealing with that have have programs that are dealing with in cities, which is you need to be proactive about getting out there and telling people what it is that you provide as a service. If you're this far removed, you're really in danger of people's knee-jerk reaction in this kind of soundbite world in which we're living.
I find it hard to believe that there are parents who aren't upset that the class size of their local schools has gone from 27, 28 kids to 40. I find that hard to believe that they aren't pretty worried about that.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
Very worried.
Yeah.
I know teachers who are worried about it too, and yeah.
Let me ask you one question, all of you, and if you all would chime in on this yourselves. You work in federal departments and agencies. You probably do business with states and localities. You probably, you may well be involved in watching over how money is spent and so on. What is this recession, after we finally get through this, and we're in that 8th year of our recovery that you're talking about, or whatever it is, what will be the effect on the capacity of states to spend federal dollars well? my question to you and to you all, do you worry about that?
Before it was just a largesse that they got, and nobody really asked what'd you use it for. But now they're tied with reports and things that says we need to know on a monthly, quarterly basis what you did with this, because we got to tell Congress what you did with it, so we can keep it flowing. And so I think they're going to get better at it. That's my personal opinion.
I will say one of the things I found about the economic stimulus, which well over $200 billion went through states and a lot of programs, was that states no longer had the people who were senior enough to be able to understand the substance and the politics so that they could do it efficiently. And it scares me, in all honesty, setting up the healthcare now, that those are the types of people you need. You need a lot of people who are fairly senior, who really understand all the functions of state government, but also understand the politics of making those changes. And that's the people who have left state government. So you're going to have to retrain them and bring them up, but that's what's missing.
I also think, and my name is Michelle Warner, I'm with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I think it's also working with states collaboratively and sitting down at the table with them to better understand what their unique environment, and I also used to work for the National Governors Association, so I have a bit of perspective, you know, having been...
You were well trained before you went over there.
There you go, Ray. You know, understanding the unique environments of states as well as local governments and regions, and seeing, communicating, at least for us, what we would like to do is communicate our policies to states with respect to what we're trying to achieve with delivery system and payment reform, as well as with the exchanges, and understand what the limitations are at the state level, what the resource limitations are, knowledge limitations, and bringing to bear resources at the federal level to work collaboratively toward a sustainable, targeted plan toward transformation.
I will give you a shout out. I think you've done a really good job in communicating with the insurance commissioners. I think that's a population that is well in tune with what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's kind of a small subset of who all needs to understand what's going on, but that's a good start.
I think part of this is also about, part of this is as we moved, and the Obama administration had some very good inclinations here. It moved very quickly into a sort of a transparency system mode, trying to create transparency and outcome-oriented results. But behind that was an intergovernmental delivery system that had been systematically dismantled over a 3-decade period. And part of the difficulty the Obama administration met in trying to go toward this performance overview was that behind that were delivery systems that were no longer in place to help. And so we're going to have to do both things simultaneously. We're going to have to rebuild an intergovernmental delivery system where the states know how to work with the feds know how to work with the states, the locals know how to work. We got people in local and state government who don't have any idea anymore. And it's gotten worse in this recession. So, you know, maybe some of the rebuilding of the intergovernmental system is going to have to be the first priority, and then we're going to need to worry about whether all that data is on a website secondarily, right? So that we at least know the money got out into the system first.
I think Department of Energy really struggled because they had no experience working with in an intergovernmental fashion when they were trying to get the stimulus dollars out, and that was hard.
Yet if you read the assessment of the stimulus from the guy who ran it, Ed DeSev, which I just read, from the federal point of view, it was terrific. He was very happy with that. There wasn't more waste, fraud, and abuse. There wasn't more trouble, blah, blah, blah. So from the federal point of view, maybe it went swimmingly. And I'm really interested to hear what you say, because I was going to actually call you up and ask you how it went from the state point of view, because I was thinking about writing a column about that.
Well, I think it went pretty well. As I said, they worked with NGA and the states, and one of the things they were very good about was that Biden was having calls with governors at the same time. So you were able to sort of, if you came up with problems, you could kick it up to a governor who was going to be talking with Biden, and it got fixed. You know?
Yeah.
Now, however, if you really want to look at it from a stimulus standpoint, you begin to look at the numbers of how fast this money spent out. It's probably a very different story.
It took longer than...
Much longer.
Well, the Medicaid money went through quickly. The other pieces, not so fast.
I think not more than 20% went in that first year.
But I see, I don't actually get, so for me, I actually think that was sort of the funny kind of weird economic arguments that circulate in this town, which was that there was all this debate about whether infrastructure, for example, was stimulus money back when the stimulus bill got passed. And so we're worried today when we still don't have a recovery, and we were feared of second dips and recessions about whether the money got out fast enough. When if you'd have tripled the size of the stimulus package and it had taken 3 years to get the money out, we'd all be talking about how great it is that there was money going out into the system last year and this year and next year, and not about a stimulus cliff that's resulting in state cuts in local aid.
That's what I think. Yeah, I agree. Any more questions? We're out of time. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your coming.